But there is something important about the relationship between intuition and the level of expertise. To approach the relationship between intuition and expertise from a different angle, it is possible to start from the research on levels of knowledge. There are three distinct streams of research on knowledge levels with very different approaches. Simon with various colleagues used primarily experimental approaches, supplemented with verbal reports, adopted phenomenological observations in various natural contexts, applied conceptual modeling based on a geometrical analogy. All these researchers argue that when one achieves a high level of expertise, intuition naturally emerges, and at the highest level it becomes the dominant form of knowledge. Therefore, we agree that expertise is an antecedent to trustworthy intuition, and hence we are only interested in intuition in those with a high level of expertise. Having established intuitive knowledge as a valid form of knowledge, we limit the scope and narrow the focus, focusing on intuition as knowledge and intuiting as knowing respectively, where considerable expertise is held, distinguishing between intuitive judgment and intuitive insight as two meaningful forms of intuitive knowledge. We need to look more closely at intuition at work, how the process of intuiting is structured. Intuition is at best regarded as mysterious and unexplainable. We do not understand its cognitive architecture. We should first become familiar with this mysterious process of intuition. We aim to shed some light on what lies behind the mystery. For the two forms of intuition, all tacit knowing can be explained on the basis of focal and subsidiary components, and that, in turn, all knowing is, at least partly, tacit. When hammering in a nail, we are differently aware of the hammer and of the nail. What is the focus of our act, the driving in the nail, which is supported by the subsidiary awareness of everything else, a feeling in our palm, hammer, etc. To help in conceptualizing the process of intuiting, we will review two kinds of awareness and the related concepts of focal and subsidiary and knowing. We will apply the distinction of focal and subsidiary to intuition and intuiting, which will help us explain the structure of intuiting. We are aware of the proximal term of an act of tacit knowing in the appearance of its distal term. We are aware of that from which we are attending to another thing, in the appearance of that thing. For further clarification, the use of these terms is illustrated through an example. If we try with our eyes closed to use a stick to explore a room, initially we will concentrate on the end of the stick in our hand, more precisely, on the feelings experienced in our fingers, thus concentrating on the near end, proximal term of the stick, even though we are really interested in what is at the far end of the stick, a distal term, the room. However, after a short period, we forget about the stick in our hand and start picturing the room's layout. This is what is meant by attending from the proximal to the distal. We are differently aware of proximal and distal. The awareness of the distal focal, as it is in the focus, and the awareness of the proximal subsidiary. In the previous case, the room is in the focus, and we have subsidiary awareness of the feelings in palm, vibrations, etc. Meaning of the text is in the focus, and the letters, grammatical rules, etc. are in the subsidiary awareness. We can see that knowing the proximal is usually tacit, as our subsidiary awareness of a thing may not suffice to make it identifiable, for whilst knowing the distal is always explicit, as a focal awareness is always conscious. What is in focus requires focal attention, and that kind of attention can be paid only to one thing at a time. This also means that the rest of the 7 ± 2 slots in the working memory can only belong to the subsidiary attention. This also fits the previous examples about exploring the room and writing. We can pay focal attention to one whole entity, a single distal term, and subsidiary attention to multiple particulars, i.e. several proximal terms. The above discussion of focal and subsidiary awareness follows from the literature. However, to apply the same line of thinking to intuition is not straightforward. Therefore, we use the more overarching concept of knowledge instead of intuition to facilitate this exploration. As we limited the notion of intuition to intuitive knowledge, what applies to all knowledge knowing should also apply to the intuitive subset of knowledge knowing. Although there are various conceptualizations of the distinction, in the case of personal knowledge, as opposed to organizational knowledge, all these authors agree that knowledge is mental content. Knowing is then seen as a process through which knowledge is used, such as learning, thinking, or applying knowledge. In considering again the example of writing, this time from the viewpoint of explicit and tacit knowledge, letters, words and rules of grammar belong to the explicit domain, learned in the classroom. However, we cannot teach in the classroom how to write a good poem, i.e. it belongs to the domain of tacit knowledge. As it was said previously, letters, words and the rules of grammar are the particulars, proximal term, subsidiary attention, whilst the poem corresponds to the whole entity, distal term, focal attention. The subsidiary knowledge is explicit, and the focal knowledge is tacit. We established that in terms of knowing, the distal is characterized by explicit knowing, and the proximal is characterized by tacit knowing. So, the tacit-explicit relation now appears to be reversed. We have identified an interesting contrast between knowledge and knowing. Whilst we can explicitly identify what we are focusing on, focal knowing, we are unable to actually provide an explicit description of this content, focal knowledge. This corresponds to being able to say that we are writing a good poem, but this does not mean that we can put into words what a good poem is. We usually cannot identify the particulars of the subsidiary attention as subsidiary knowing. If someone would point these out for us, we might be able to provide an explicit account about the content of these particulars, subsidiary knowledge. We cannot say which letters and rules of grammar we use when writing the poem, but if someone asked about them, we could explain them explicitly. The root cause of the difference is that tacit explicit knowledge refers to the nature of the content, whilst the tacit explicit knowing is about identifying this content. So what we focus on can be characterized by tacit knowledge and explicit knowing, whilst our subsidiary awareness is characterized by explicit knowledge and tacit knowing. We apply these findings to intuition, intuitive knowledge, and intuiting process of intuitive knowing in order to understand the structure of intuiting. We describe a characteristic which leads to an apparent contradiction. This contradiction, together with the focal subsidiary distinction, serve as the starting point for understanding the structure of intuiting. Intuition is arrived at without the use of analytic methods or calculation, non-linear mode of thinking, non-logical, to contrast it to the logical process of analytical reasoning, knowledge gained without rational thought. Although the terminology is slightly different, in every case the message is that intuiting operates independently of the general principles of logic. We call this mode of operation alogical, meaning that it neither follows logical nor contradicts the illogical, the rules of logic. Intuition and analysis are not operating independent of each other, but rather in a complementary manner. Intuition and judgment, at least good judgment, are simply analyses frozen into habit, and into the capacity for rapid response through recognition. Intuition is about synthesis, and synthesis can never be derived from analyses. It seems reasonable to ask whether this apparent contradiction can be resolved. Intuition, as experts recognizing patterns relevant to their experience. Intuition includes synthesis, and this is completely consistent with the view of intuition as pattern recognition. Analyses frozen into habit. Analysis here may not mean the opposite of synthesis, but the opposite of intuition, which seems plausible from the previous quote. This would mean that the non-intuitions frozen into habit, constituting intuition. We explore whether it is possible to understand how these non-intuitions may constitute intuition by applying to intuition intuiting what we have discussed about knowledge, knowing in terms of the focal subsidiary distinction. Intuition can usually be decomposed into its constituents, and by doing so the intuitor can arrive at a logical explanation of the intuitive outcome. By combining the two descriptions, it is possible to gain a better understanding of intuition. The distal term that we pay focal attention to is the focal intuition intuiting. It corresponds to the whole entity, the room we are exploring using a stick, and the meaning of the text when writing. The focal intuition is tacit and alogical, and the focal intuiting is explicit and logi. As we can identify the outcome of intuiting, we can accept that focal intuiting is explicit, and as its content cannot be taught in a classroom setting, the focal intuition is considered tacit. The proximal term of intuition, what we pay subsidiary attention to, is the subsidiary intuition intuiting, at the near end of the stick when exploring the room, or the knowledge of letters and grammar when writing a poem. We expect that the subsidiary intuition is logical and can be put into words as it could be taught in a classroom setting, and that the subsidiary intuiting is tacit and alogical, as we cannot identify the particulars. Of course, we could pay attention to the particulars, only then we would probably lose the sight of the whole entity, and focus upon a particular aspect. If we focus on the whole entity, the particulars get submerged. What we have not explained so far is how the subsidiary particulars come together into the whole entity on which we focus in the process of intuiting. Particulars fuse into the whole entity as long as the person sustains it. Integration and extends the concept of tacit knowing to this integrative process. What is subsidiarily known is tacitly known, but it seems appropriate to extend the meaning of a tacit knowing to include the integration of subsidiary to focal knowing. The structure of tacit knowing is then the structure of this integrative process, and knowing is tacit to the extent to which it has such a structure. For better understanding of subsidiary intuition, we need to figure out what the particulars are. These are the components of the explanation. This is why it always has to be obtained afterwards. There can be rules to follow and methods to apply, but they have little to do with how we arrived at the intuitive knowledge. We might have used some of the rules, methods, only they have undergone a tacit process of integration.